So, for those of you who have been following along, it has been a very exciting 2026 Democratic primary season, specifically for the midterms. Now, we know that the general election is in November, but we've been seeing a lot of very competitive primaries all across the United States. Now, kicking things off in Texas with the infamous Senate Democratic primary between State House Rep. James Tallarico, who is now the Democratic nominee for the United States Senate representing Texas, and with Rep. Jasmine Crockett, who gave a strong performance in the Lone Star State. So we also saw a very interesting turnout in the state of Illinois. Not only did we see a strong Juliana Stratton win her Democratic nomination to become the next senator from Illinois, but also with a lot of the House races where progressives didn't have the night they were hoping for. Now, looking at Illinois House District 9, in their 9th congressional district, we saw Kat Abughazaleh in a 12-way, 10-way primary, where essentially she was one of the top 3 candidates coming in second place, each splitting the vote with just over 20%. Between Jasmine Crockett's performance in Texas and Kat Abughazaleh in Illinois' 9th, what do they have in common, and how did both of these strong progressive women just barely miss the mark in their respective primaries? Now, I know it's always hard to have these conversations, especially on the left, because we love to champion our own, we love to rise up, we don't like to drag down. But here's the thing, we do need to be a little more critical of the left if we're going to be, become a strong force and really gain the power that we rightfully deserve. AOC really started this new era of progressive politics, specifically after she took out the incumbent Joe Crowley after being outspent like well over 10-1. The fact that she even, really ran on a shoestring budget, but spoke from the heart with a fiery passion on progressive issues that truly matter to the district. Now, that exact model, by being able to paint the incumbent as out of touch or as the enemy, so to speak, is also the same model that we saw with Zohran Mamdani, who won his mayoral primary. Both AOC and Zohran also had the strongest campaigns that had a hybrid model, both on the ground with on-the-ground boots organizing, strong organizing ties with local community groups, but also a lot of face time with voters, on top of a very strong social media presence with a digital fluency where they could speak and communicate and articulate the ideas in short, synthesized talking points that were memorable, that were progressive, and really encapsulated who they were as leaders, but also what their campaigns represented. Now, those were the strongest models that we've seen in a very long time. And of course, they had to really overcome these juggernauts of challengers between former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, and congressional rep Joseph Crowley, who was in Congress without a serious challenger for like over a decade. So this was the model that the left needed in order to really replicate. And if they were able to do that successfully, they could take down power after district and really reform the Democratic Party. Now, unfortunately, we also know that the outsized influence of money in politics is the only reason why not the only reason why, it is the largest reason why our progressive movement has not materialized as much as we had hoped on such a massive scale in Congress. Now, fortunately, we have seen progressive wins in more local elections, such as state assembly races, state senate, right? Even city council. So we know that grassroots power and energy will have to build up the bench with strong local leaders. But what can we do right now in the 2026 midterm elections, knowing that we are not even halfway there yet? We just had our biggest contests in March. We have no primaries in April, but we do have the next round coming up in May, and then the largest round in June. So we know right now between Rep. Jasmine Crockett and Kat Abughazaleh, they both ran as fighters. They both ran phenomenal campaigns that really exceeded expectations, and they both did very well with their electorate. Now, we know that Rep. Jasmine Crockett had a few challenges that hurt her from the beginning. For instance, one she entered the race in December, while Tallarico entered in September. He had a few months on her when campaigning. Number 2, she is a congressional rep who has to meet in Washington, D.C. She couldn't be on the ground and organizing as much as James, who essentially had the Texas State House wasn't in session as often, so he had the liberty to go around and visit tons of counties, especially along the southern border, and really connect with those communities. Now, it's not that Jasmine didn't do any on the ground organizing. It's just that James was there more frequently and really showed up at really rural areas that those communities were not expecting to see Democrats. So not only that, but also based on the message. We know that Jasmine Crockett really ran a strong 2018 campaign, right? If you think about her message, right? Being a strong woman of color, running on progressive ideals, and also with her messaging really fighting Trump, these all resonated well with the electorate in 2018, but it didn't necessarily update the message for today's electorate. We also know that Jasmine is a firebrand and says whatever she's thinking, and that's why we love her. But some of her comments might have been offensive to Latino communities, but also maybe just didn't connect in the way that she was hoping. Now, Tallarico, on the other hand, while he does not have the same energy or vigor, he did come across as a smooth, stable leader. His background as a seminary, right? He toned down his rhetoric, but he was also very clear when he spoke. And in doing so, he was able to then get more people to bring into his campaign, building a broad coalition not only between white progressives, Latinos in rural areas of Texas, but really just getting a swath of the Democratic Party where even if, let's say, he did win the more college-educated voters and that are high information voters, Jasmine performed really well with black voters, capturing like 93% of black voters in the Democratic primary. Like, that is insanely great. 93% is almost unheard of. But that being said, it didn't actually push her across the finish line. Now, it would have been great if she was able to cut into the margins from other, demographic groups. But at the end of the day, her message was very, very focused on fighting Trump and also what that meant for her community. Now, if you also think about it, James Tallarico did a really good job garnering local support. Now, and that was crucial to his success. Not only was he able to work on those local connections that he had, not only in the state house, right, since he was representing his district there for quite some time, but also it was able to get people to vouch for him sooner. So then it's a matter of, do you choose between Jasmine or James? It then became a question of, well, if I'm already supporting James, why would I switch to Jasmine? Because he got out sooner, that gave him such a leg up advantage that Jasmine wasn't able to overcome. In case you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to give us a like, share your feedback with a comment, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Now, back to the show. Now, in terms of Kat Abughazaleh, now we know that AIPAC spent an upward of $7 million on the Illinois 9th congressional race. That is a lot of money for one congressional race. Like, most candidates can't even raise that on their own. The fact that a super PAC like that is coming in, that is a huge amount of influence. So, granted, according to reports, AIPAC had spent $1.18 million specifically attacking Kat Abughazaleh through ads. So, now granted, Kat Abughazaleh was one of the best fundraiser in the field, where she raised over like $2.7 million on her own from grassroots donations. So kudos to her for even having a strong campaign message that resonated with donors, specifically grassroots donors. So the catch here, though, if it's a little dissimilar from Jasmine, but we know that Rep. Crockett, she was a congressional rep, national firebrand, and definitely had that fight and that vigor that so many people fall in love with her for. Kat Abughazaleh also had that vigor. She also came across as someone who was willing to fight at every turn, every corner, to push back against Republican propaganda and messaging, but also counter it with her own very sharp progressive messaging. She had probably had the best messaging that we've seen in a very long time, not only in Illinois, but I would argue nationally. So, Kat having that really strong media background, right? She's worked at so many great nonprofits and other media focused groups that it really gave her an edge on how to communicate with the electorate. However, as much as her message was strong in terms of fighting, we also know the big Achilles heel to the left is always, always, always how we channel the line of fire when attacking opponents. Democrats, generally speaking, Democratic voters, they are proud to be Democrats. They are proud to feel like they are part of a larger movement. And they are proud to take the high road, right? We all remember Michelle Obama, right? We all know like that type of high road framing doesn't work as much in today's electorate, considering Trump has now won the presidency twice. But we do know that Democrats still want to be considered, right? The guys who play nice, the people who are, fair and reasonable. So one of the challenges that I think Kat never really overcame was that her really strong, forceful messaging criticizing her Democratic opponents or even Democratic leadership, right? Didn't necessarily resonate well with the electorate who would be participating in the primary. Now, it's one thing to get, progressives like fired up and excited, but it's another to then like offset and like get more moderate, more centrist Democratic voters in your corner. Now, when you see folks like AOC and Zohran, who are strong socialists, who are strong and very forceful in their messaging, you'll note how they both were easily able to identify an antagonist. AOC's antagonist was Joe Crowley, painted him as out of touch and bought by corporations. It was very easy to identify that. Zohran Mamdani, if you notice how he talked to the other candidates, right? Like Brad Lander, fellow progressive in the race, they never attacked each other. They always kept it positive. Zohran saved his sharpest criticisms for former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who was very much made a villain already, considering his own horrible sexual assault scandals from 2021. So seeing how Zohran and AOC were able to paint their opponent, right, who was already susceptible to these attacks, right? It's not like they didn't have to do much work to do that because they already had their own bad behaviors. But my point is, these opponents were able to be, really characterized as the enemy. Whereas in this race, for Kat Abughazaleh, remember, this was an open primary. Now, it started off with Rep. Jan Schakowsky as the incumbent who, Kat was ready to challenge one-on-one. But then Schakowsky knew that if she stepped down from the seat, it would open Pandora's box for any candidate to throw their hat into the ring. And they sure did. So Daniel Biss, who has run for office several times, not only as governor he's run for state senate. He clearly mayor of Evanston, so he even has political experience as mayor. Him having more of this campaign experience did make him a more credible challenger. And because he was progressive, right, it became harder for Kat to distance or really paint him as an outsider or someone who is the enemy or is corrupt just by, virtue of being, corrupt on policy or even his record. Daniel Biss did have a decent enough record with his own progressive credentials, right? He even got the endorsement of Senator Elizabeth Warren. So another senator who is beloved, right? She ran for president in 2020 on a strong populist message. Even though she didn't win that primary, she did, build a lot of goodwill amongst her base. So to then share that goodwill with Daniel Biss, that was a really hard challenge for Kat to overcome. Now, on top of that, Daniel Biss was able, because he already was an elected official as mayor, he's already proven that he can win elections. And because of that, he was able to at least, let's say wiggle his way into getting support from the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Now, we know there's like over 90 members in the CPC, like Pramila Jayapal, AOC, right? There's so many great progressives, even though, let's be real, most of the people in the CPC, they're not really that progressive. Like, they're progressive-ish, but not on all issues, right? So when it comes down to it, there's probably like a handful that are like truly progressive, and even fewer that are actually democratic socialists. But at the end of the day, as long as we have a huge voting bloc that will come together around the big issues, that is key. So the fact that Daniel Biss was already, building the relationship with the CPC, who did actually donate to his campaign during this primary, that also sends a signal that, Kat would have to overcome the establishment ties and being able to, how can she then prove to voters, like, well, if I'm running to be a progressive in Congress, but the CPC is already working with the other candidate, it does make for a harder sell. It's just unfortunate that not only was she younger, and that may have hurt her trying to build relationships with, more established voters, it also was a challenge for Kat where maybe she didn't have as much institutionalized local support as she would have needed, right? Now, granted, that $1.1 million from AIPAC against her clearly didn't help. Of course, with all the other spending in that race, definitely didn't help her case. But at the end of the day, the fact that it became so close, right? Showing how that local institutional support could have helped, not necessarily even gain votes because it was from the group supporters, but think about it. Where was Bernie Sanders? Where was Zohran Mamdani? Where was AOC? It's not to say that they should have endorsed Kat, but it is to say the way Kat presented her campaign as being more antagonistic to the Democratic Party and Democratic voters. If you all remember her infamous tagline when she launched her campaign, her big question was, what if we didn't suck? Now, while that's great that so many progressive and young voters resonated with that message, I can assure you that older, Democratic, more traditional, likely primary voters, they didn't think we suck. They just think Republicans suck. So to hear the criticism being brought on them, or at least they probably internalized that message, didn't help her case build over those voters. So, unfortunately, because of the way I think the campaign may have been framed, didn't allow her to build those relationships with local institutionalized groups, which would then allow her to gain support from more established leaders. And even at the end of the day, right, the last leg of the campaign, the closing days, that's when Kat Abughazaleh got the endorsement from Rashida Tlaib. Rashida's endorsement is powerful, but it didn't help cross the finish line. It also came very late into the election. It was already, early voting was almost done by that point. So just the idea that it came so late, while Kat had good framing of her message, I don't think she framed her campaign or positioned her campaign in the best light as being able to work with. Because again, if she's criticizing the Democratic Party and the systems, it became more antagonistic and less friendly. And she wasn't able to get the local institutional support, but it also prevented her from getting more credible leaders endorsing her campaign to build her up and get her over the finish line. But hey, end of the day, phenomenal campaign, took a chance, ran a really strong effort for a grassroots first-time candidate. She has a bright future ahead of her. I strongly recommend that she, works on those relationships now. Then come, 2028 or 2030, she should definitely challenge Daniel Biss if she's still in the district, right? Definitely, run for office again. Whether it's a more local race, like a state house race, she would do just fine. And I strongly support Kat in her future efforts because you know that she will always be truly herself, and that is very important. Between Rep. Jasmine Crockett and Kat Abughazaleh, we know these strong progressive fighters definitely have a bright future ahead of them. The challenges of them building the relationships, getting in these races sooner, but also framing their campaigns in a way that can be more embracing their respective electorates, allowing more people into the fold rather than forward focused on, the line of fire. I think that could truly serve them better in their future political careers because at the end of the day, they are both phenomenal candidates, and I cannot wait to see what they do next. And that's our show. Thank you so much for tuning in to Not Suitable for Democracy. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Or you can follow along for more news and updates on Instagram and TikTok. I use the same handle for both, so you can follow along at NSFD_pod. Now, next episode is going to be our 40th, and we are going to be focusing on the No Kings demonstration happening right here in New York City on Saturday, March 28th. There are over 3,000 demonstrations happening around the country, so try to find one near you. And if there's not, try to organize one yourself. This is how we get involved, build our community, and what we have seen over the past few months is that these demonstrations and marches are actually helping Democrats win these local elections, specifically special elections. So if you like to build community, like to speak out, and like to be the change in the world, then make sure to participate in a No Kings March near you, Saturday, March 28th. And remember, democracy is not suitable without you.